All right, everybody, welcome to week 8. Oh, I'm getting confused now. Welcome to week 8, where we talk about listening. And some of you might be thinking, I don't need to listen to this video. It's something that I just do naturally. However, we are not natural listeners. It is not something, just like communication, it takes work and practice. And that's exactly what we're going to go through today. So we're going to talk about the nature of listening, ways to listen, communication barriers to effective listening, and becoming a better listener. So you'll hear me talk about listening or active listening, and I use those quite interchangeably because listening in itself is an active process, and what we do when we listen is make meaning out of another person's spoken message. That means that no, listening is not automatic. It is something that we put effort into, and it requires more than just hearing, which we are inherent hearers. Every time I say that, it makes me feel so weird. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about our listening styles. So we don't all listen the same, despite what we may think. And this comes up. We all have multiple styles depending on what is laid before us. So we have relational, task-oriented, critical, and analytical. Relational is puts an emphasis on emotions and interests of others. Task-oriented is concise, error-free presentation. So if you think about more of a businessy type of listening style, critical is intellectual challenges. So if you think of critical of the way that you listen in class. And then analytical is without holding judgment while listening. So you're trying to take in the information and break it down so you can understand better and understand all sides of what you're hearing before making up your mind about the information. Listening effectively is so important. I just mentioned 4 different types of listening styles, and each one of them crawls its way into your life in one way or another. So because we spend so much of our day while we're awake listening to others, having good listening skills are essential for your relationships, for your workplace success, for your education, for social aspects of your life. So actively listening and effectively is important. There are, however, some misconceptions of listening, and I kind of already mentioned a couple, but myth, hearing is the same as listening. It is not. Hearing is biological. It's something that is simply just hearing the noises. But if we go back to language, and you remember how language is arbitrary until we give it meaning, hearing is something that's inherent, but we have to still decode what we hear to make it listening or make an active effort to listen. Another myth, listening is natural and effortless. It is not. Listening is, it takes effort. Listening is something that we have to be mindful to do, that we have to put effort into to make sure that we're hearing effectively, that we're understanding what is being said, and then all listeners hear the same message. So I use an example. I've actually recorded this lecture already, but my file crashed, so I'm re-recording it. But in my example, I say that if you're in class, right, and we talk about how so many different external factors impact, or internal factors, but they impact the way that we communicate, and the same thing goes for listening. If you're having a bad day, but the student beside you is having a great day, there could be psychological barriers that prevent you from hearing the same message that they are. So maybe while you're tuned out because you're not having a good day, you miss that next class is canceled. And you show up to next class and you're saying, well, like, no one told me. Somebody might have told you and you weren't effectively listening. So no, not all of us hear the messages the same. And then, of course, we always talk about culture and gender, um, and how it impacts, sorry, how it impacts the way that we listen, or the way that we're expected to listen. So a really good example um, is there was a study, according to our textbook, that determined that men were more likely than women to interrupt someone that they're listening to. And women were also shown to maintain eye contact while listening to their conversational partner more than men did. So that's just a couple examples of how we listen and how it differs from gender to gender. I want to pause here, and I want you guys, I've given you just a very very quick run through of the first couple slides, and I want you to watch the um, Legally Blonde example of active listening that is in week 8 module. Take a listen to it. If anyone's never seen the movie, Elle Woods is played by Reese Witherspoon, and uh, she's on a dinner date with her boyfriend Warner, and they have different ideas of what's going to happen in this date. However, while he's talking, she's taking in she's I'm trying to think of the words. She's partaking, thank you, in active listening, and she's doing so by by providing feedback. Right? We talked about the nonverbal cues. She's nodding her head. She's saying keywords that allow Warner to know she's listening. Unfortunately, the video cuts off, but it does continue later on to show how the communication does break down, because she already has what she thinks is gonna happen in her mind, and he says something different. So the communication breakdown is probably more of a long-term relationship thing rather than a in that single moment thing. But take a look at that example, and then kind of go through the first couple slides that we talked about and think about it. What was her listening style? Um, what do you think the difference between those two, based on their gender, impacted the way that they're listening? And then come back, and we will talk about the Hurrier model. Okay, I put a good pause there. If anyone paused and came back, welcome back. So the Hurrier model. The Hurrier model explains the stages of effective listening. And if you want to apply the Elle Woods example to this, you absolutely can. So the Hurrier model stands for hearing, understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. I guess and's not in there. I just said and. So hearing, again, that's the biological process of hearing sounds. Sorry, it's really early in the morning, so I'm drinking some tea. Understanding. This is kind of where when I talk about listening, this is where I sit with a lot of how listening differs from hearing. Understanding is figuring out if you can process what you heard. Are there barriers to what you heard? Is there a language barrier? Is there a noise barrier or something impacting the way that you can understand the message? If you heard the message, but it was in another language, you can't understand it. So you can't effectively listen. And then remembering what someone said. This helps with developing further relationships. If somebody comes up to you and says, "Hi, my name is Janet," and they shake your hand. Oh, wait, hold on. I don't want to get the shake hand. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do the remembering first. So they say, "Hi, I'm Janet." You want to remember that name, because if you forget it, it may not seem like you were listening. Now, interpreting, looking at their nonverbal and verbal behaviors and utilizing your own to understand what's being said, right? So now going to the handshake, right? She says, "Hi, I'm Janet," and then you interpret that she's putting her hand out to shake your hand, that she's probably trying to open a dialogue or greet you, and it's a positive greeting because she's got a smile on her face. You're interpreting this as a positive conversation, or the opening of a positive conversation. And that's you interpreting. interpreting, thank you. Evaluating. And then this is kind of where, as you're shaking her hand, you're judging the interaction for accuracy, truthfulness, facts, and opinions, and context. So she shakes your hand, and in the context, you think this is, if say she's introducing herself because you're interviewing her for a job. In the context of a job interview, you have no reason to believe that she's being untruthful or inaccurate about what her name is. So judging for accuracy and truthfulness, you believe her name is Janet, which leads you to think that it is a fact, not an opinion, that her name is Janet. I don't know why I picked Janet. It was just the first name that came to my mind. And then giving feedback, responding. Think about those nonverbal cues. Think about those verbal. What you would say back? I'd probably say, "Hi, my name is Allison," and then I would shake her hand back, and maybe I'd smile to let her know this is a safe space, and something like that. So these are all pieces. Next time you have an interaction, think of the Hurrier model of listen and of effective listening, and think: are you taking in every piece of the model to be an effective listener? Okay. So now that we've talked about effective ways of listening, let's talk about types of listening. There's three types of listening that we're going to learn about: informational listening, critical listening, and empathic listening. So there's a couple examples now of some of this information or some of these listening types that I want you to look at as I talk about them, and I'll point out which ones go with what. So informational listening, that's listening to learn, like you're doing right now in this class. You're partaking in informational listening. Critical listening, listening to judge and analyze. That's not to say that it's like a negative. It doesn't have. It's not intended to have like a negative connotation to it, right? It's just saying that your goal is to analyze what you're hearing. So think about a commercial. You're analyzing the information you're getting to understand if this is something that you want to purchase. And empathic listening, that's listening to experience another person's feelings. So the next 3 slides are kind of me explaining the different types of listening. So first we have the informational listening, and we do this by taking notes, or when we take notes or watch the news, or when we're trying to pay attention to driving directions. Sometimes it's a relatively passive process because we're not, like if you think about driving, you're still doing other things. But it's intended to just take in information and learn something new rather than analyze it and decide for yourself. So if Siri tells you to take a left, you don't have to analyze taking a left if that's the right choice. You're under the assumption that she's giving you the best directions possible. So informational listening, I want you to take a pause here and watch the Erin Brockovich example I have in the module this week, and think about the way that she's partaking or participating in informational listening. This is a great example, great movie if you ever need a movie suggestion. So take a listen to that one. Okay, and then we go into critical listening. This means listening to evaluate and analyze. And like I mentioned, it's like when we watch a commercial to see if we want to buy a product. It doesn't mean that we're criticizing what we're hearing. Rather, we're just evaluating to see if this is something that we want to purchase. And then we have empathic listening, and that's trying to understand what the speaker is thinking or feeling. It helps us understand the situation from another person's point of view, kind of like we say, walking in somebody else's shoes. And it gives you the ability to identify how someone is feeling and experience those feelings for ourselves. And so the first part of this is putting yourself in their situation and trying to see it from their point of view. And the second part of it is identifying how they're feeling and how it makes you feel. And so the other example I have for this it's the inside out example of empathic listening. And Bing Bong has just lost his wagon that he used to use with Riley. And Joy is trying to distract and kind of dismissing his feelings, um, to just move on to keep him happy. But Sadness, who honestly not my favorite character, but she is a great example of empathic listening. She realizes that he feels deeply about what has happened, and she uses some of those listening skills um, to 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 make him feel seen and heard. And so some of those listening skills, if you want to take a look, are on page 230 of your textbook. It's under the responding portion of the Hurrier model. So she paraphrases what he says back to her, to show that she's listening. She empathizes with him. She supports him, by letting him know it must not feel good. And so take a look. Some of those examples of responding, to let you know that it's active: stonewalling, back channeling, paraphrasing, empathizing, supporting, analyzing, and advising. So take a look at those. Those are on page 230 of your textbook. But yeah, empathetic listening, empathic, empathetic, empathic, empathic. That's what it is. Sorry, it's really early in the morning. Okay, and then so going from those types of listening, those types of effective listening can also happen online. And we always input some sort of online aspect to the way we learn, because communication is developing. Well, as technology is developing, communication has to develop within it as well. So effective listening can happen online, and it's possible that people find support groups online who can listen and participate actively and empathetically to what you have to say, to make you feel seen, to have your feelings seen. But part of that, because it's not face to face, there's some key things that you need to be aware of, to make sure that you're being an effective listener online. So first thing is being attentive to what others are saying. This is this is important, because when you're interacting with someone online, sometimes it's easy to be distracted by other things in your environment or around you. So if it's all online and you're in your room and the TV's on, or your brother's outside making a ruckus. Oh my gosh, it sounds so old when I say that. It could be hard. Or maybe you're watching TV and checking your email, or you're driving, or you're dividing your tasks. So sometimes it's hard, but you to make sure that to be that effective listener, that you're giving all that attention you need to what that person is saying. Remembering that words can be misinterpreted online. When we communicate in person, face to face, I've just given you a whole slew of things that we use to understand the true message, like our body language, our a whole bunch of our nonverbals, right? So maybe it's our eye contact, maybe it's the way that the person is dressed, or maybe it's the oh my gosh, the tone of their voice, their vocalics, right? So with all those things that are now missing if you read a comment or a text or an email, you have to remember that these words can be misinterpreted. And so because we have to rely on the words specifically, while you're reading these things, if something seems like maybe it doesn't make sense, or maybe it comes out of left field as kind of malicious, ask for clarification. It's the best place to do it, because it's understanding that these aren't things that we're meant to know in a situation of computer mediated communication, right? We're not supposed to know exactly how they sent it, in what context they sent it in. And then, of course, don't be a lurker. I'm guilty sometimes of joining Facebook groups and then not commenting anything, but taking all the information from those groups. And so in support groups or other online communities, a lurker is somebody who just reads other people's words but then doesn't contribute to the conversation. And picture this. If this was an in-person situation and you were in a group setting and you were just staring at people talk, it would come off kind of creepy, right? So don't be a lurker online either. Contribute. Let people know that you're seen and heard. In your textbook, the research says that 90% of users in online communities are lurkers who never contribute to the discussion. So don't feel bad if you are the lurker, but just understand that it's not an effective way to be a good listener. Because if you're lurking, you're probably not asking follow-up questions. You're probably not back channeling and providing feedback. You're just taking in somebody's vulnerable moments. Now, we talked about effective listening, but things can get in the way. And that's called noise. And noise isn't just the physical noise like a vacuum or a loud TV or your brother causing a ruckus outside. Like noise is anything that distracts us from what we're listening to. It can be physical, it can be psychological. If we go back to that example of maybe you having a bad day and missing that your teacher canceled the next class, that's noise. Psychologically, you weren't checked in because something was going on. And so you missed it. And that's noise. And it's noise. So think about all your senses, right? You're hearing, you're seeing, you're feeling. Maybe you're tasting, causing an effect. Something you're touching causes you to not be a good listener. Like the chair's too cold, so you're not paying attention in class. It's your senses that are causing the noise. And so if you think about like today, right? Or COVID or online classes or any time that you had to do something online, how many of you had just your class open? How many of you had your phone on scrolling through social media while you were listening to class? How many of you had TV, Netflix on, the game, right? We've grown into this society where multitasking is the standard. And it's the noise that causes us to be poor listeners. So yes, think about that as we talk about noise and other common barriers for effective listening. And some of those other barriers include pseudo listening and selective attention. And this is something I think we can all relate to. Ow, I just stubbed my toe so hard. So pseudo listening is pretending to pay attention to somebody. We all have, I'm sure, been guilty of this when maybe our parents are talking to us, or maybe even like a partner or a spouse or a friend or a teacher. You want to be a listener, but you're just checked out. Maybe for me, it's my dad. He can talk very slowly. And I know that he really does want my attention, so I pretend to pay attention. And that's pseudo listening. And another example we have of this is in our module for this week, the What Women Want example. And Mel Gibson, I want to say that's who it is. Mel Gibson is paying or pseudo listening to one of, I'm assuming it's just another guy in the scene. And he's talking about something. And in the scene, you can see that he's giving the standard nonverbal cues of, yes, I'm listening. But of course, as an actor, he's also portraying that he's kind of checked out. He's not really paying attention. And we could consider that pseudo listening. So pseudo listening and selective attention, slightly different. Selective attention means only listening to what we want. So selective listening, or sorry, I keep saying selective listening, selective attention. You are listening to parts of what they're saying, and then just pseudo listening to the others. So you're just nodding your head, listening to the other stuff. So say, for example, your mom says, or you ask your mom, Mom, can I go to the mall with my friends? And she says, yes, you can go to the mall with your friends after you finish your homework. And you go, okay, thanks. You go get ready. And as you're leaving, your mom says, did you do your homework? And you say, no. And I said, well, I told you, or she says, I told you you couldn't do your home, or you couldn't go to the mall until you did your homework. You're now in a fight with your mom because you only heard what you wanted to hear and didn't hear the entire message. This happened a lot in my childhood. That's an example of a personal factor of mine. So think about that. Take a minute. Maybe you're a parent. Maybe you're the child. Have you ever participated in pseudo listening and selective attention to somebody's message? And how did that communication interaction turn out? All right. Then another common barrier is information overload. Information overload is when we're exposed to so many different messages that it can be hard to pay attention to the ones that we might think are the important ones, or we maybe don't know at the time that they're the important ones. This is super common, ironically, with online. When you're listening to this, right? I'm giving you, I think like 40 minutes of direct information overload. Now, you could pause it and break it down, but I would consider this the linear model of communication, right? So I'm just giving you all this information. There's really no opportunity to actively provide feedback to me. So if you pause, you'd have to email me back, and it might take a couple hours or a day. And at that point, it's really broken down the communication. So with this information overload, and I'm giving you all this information, I try to make it as conversational and easy to digest as possible, but it's still part of who we are as humans to be overwhelmed by information that's new to us. And if I give you 40 minutes of new information with no break, that could cause ineffective listening. You might have already tuned me out. You might not be listening to this part. And then glazing over. I go back to my dad example. My dad, again, talks slow, and sometimes my mind wanders to, I wonder when he's going to stop. I wonder what to have for lunch. I wonder, is he talking? Oh, wait, is he stopped? Is he waiting for something from me? Should I nod my head? Okay, nod my head. Yeah. And I glaze over, and sometimes I miss important details, and I don't have critical thinking or critical listening skills in that moment, and I might miss the important part to him of what that story was supposed to be. So this also happens in class. Most of us are capable of listening to or understanding, 600 words per minute, but because we are usually only able to speak 150 words per minute, all that spare time is used in la la land for the most part, for most people, and that's how we glaze over. All right, let's go into another one. Rebuttal tendency. So who here, I say who here as if I'm going to see you raise your hands, but who here has ever listened or been in an argument with somebody and you're listening to what they're saying, but only just so you can form your own reply? You're not really listening. You're hearing what they're saying, but you're picturing what you're going to say in return. If you've ever done that, that is called a rebuttal tendency. So if you like rebuttal tendency, you're taking the mental energy that you should be listening and you're using it to form your point. And so you're jumping to conclusions while missing some of the key points that are said from the speaker. So you can miss out on important details, and it's kind of a self-centered thing. So that's rebuttal tendency. Think about it. Think about how you've ever tuned somebody out just to get your point across. Another point of barriers for effective listening, closed-mindedness. Closed-mindedness is not listening to anybody that you disagree with, or not listening to any points that you disagree with. Not everyone is fully closed-minded, but there are some things that many people are closed-minded about few things. And this is not a politics class. This is not intended to be provocative or anything, but by nature, politics tend to lead people to be closed-minded. From the entire spectrum of the political field, there are people who won't listen to one side or the other because it doesn't fall within what they're supposed to be told, that is their party's one or the other, like either way. Like, so I'm saying, like, if one party says a point and maybe it's a good point, but you're closed-minded because that your party didn't say it, both sides super guilty of it. And that's closed-mindedness. That's, you're missing out on fantastic or good or positive or helpful information just because you don't agree with it as a more broad statement. Competitive interrupting. Competitive interrupting is the goal of it is to speak more than the other person. And keeping this in like the politics realm, this happens a lot with politicians. I think everybody wants to be heard and said, and so you'll see debates where they talk out of turn or they continue talking after their time's up. It's trying to be the main character. And if you're older like me, main character is, like just being that person who thinks that the world revolves around them. So think about maybe a friend group of yours that there's always that one person who insists to butt in because their information is more important. That's competitive interrupting. They think that what their words are more important than yours, and they have to keep getting those words out there and cutting you off. Now, there are other ways to interrupt, and they're not all inherently competitive. Some interruptions can be interruptions of excitement or agreement. Like, yeah, oh my God, I saw that too. But the intention is to let them know, or let the person who's speaking know that they agree with them, but to keep speaking. Or something to agree if we're having an empathic conversation or empathic listening. Oh, I understand. That must be hard. And then continuing to let them speak. So not every interruption is competitive, but the ones that are intended to take control of the situation, to take control of the conversation. So we've talked about the barriers at a glance, right? We've talked about noise. We've talked about pseudo-listening. We've talked about selective attention, information overload, glazing over, our rebuttal tendency, our closed-mindedness, and our competitive interrupting. So now we know those things. How do we become better listeners? Being a better listener, let's start with information first. To be a better informational listener, you have to separate what's said and what's not said. So sometimes we have to be aware of the tendency to hear words or statements that aren't actually said. If you saw a commercial for maybe some painkillers and the advertiser said, nothing is more effective than this. What do you learn from hearing that statement? Like, how would you paraphrase? How would you interpret that? The advertiser is hoping that you're saying that it's the strongest one available. But that's not really what they said. They said nothing is more effective. Which means that there may be other products that are just as effective, but the way that you interpret it in that moment thinks of it as the greatest and the best and the only one on that tier. So we have to separate what's said and what's not said. We also have to avoid confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the tendency to pay attention only to information that supports what we believe, and then ignore everything that doesn't. And it becomes a problem when we try to make our minds up about an issue without listening to every side. This happens a lot, again, in politics. I think politicians are corrupt, so it comes up a lot. But if somebody takes, say, a study done by medical researchers and pulls a piece of that data out of context and says, that vaccines are only effective in children and not in adults. So you shouldn't get a flu shot as an adult. That's, by the way, I just made that up. Okay. I'm not saying this has actually happened. This is just me making something up. That may, if that's the only information that you get, right, and you don't do your own research because you agree with me, then that's confirmation bias. You sought out what I said and did no other research just to confirm your point. When in reality, I actually took that information from a larger study that specified a specific type of vaccine, maybe for, trying to think of childhood things. Is whooping cough one? Okay, let's say whooping cough. I think that's one. I'm not a medical doctor, guys, or a parent. And so if the study was about whooping cough and how it was more effective in children than it was in adults, that is a completely different context than the information I gave you that said all vaccines. So you have to make sure that when you do read things, even though they may alert you to what you're saying, or they may, oh my gosh, the word I'm looking for, they may strengthen your perspective or your stance, you have to make sure that you're looking at it from a larger picture. Is this the only information? Is this accurate? And as listeners, we have to make sure we look for that. And of course, listening for style over substance. Nope, that's wrong. Listening for substance more than style. That's right. Not all that glitters is gold. And even though we know that, we have the tendency to focus on the bright and shiny information, even if it's more style than substance. So we have the tendency, there's something called the vividness effect, and it's a tendency for dramatic, shocking events to distort our perceptions of reality. So if we watch the news every day, which, I mean, I used to work in news, this is something that this has happened to me. I'm guilty of this. If we watch it every day and there's news coverage on a deadly plane crash or something to do with engine failure or emergency landings and all these things, right? We are now more nervous about getting on a plane, even though the probability of a plane crash is like 1 in 8 million. My husband is a pilot and he flies on commercial planes, and he tells me this all the time. But I've always had a fear of flying. And so I hear this every time because again, like working in news and covering some really major plane incidents, more recently in January when the plane crash in DC claimed 67 lives. That was my husband's airline. And even though it was closer to home and it felt so like it could happen to me, even though it was close to home and I felt like it would happen to me, the statistic doesn't change. It's still 1 in 8 million. But because of the vividness effect and because it was a dramatic event and because it happened so close to home, I was more likely to be afraid of flying. And so that's why when I say listen to style over substance, I keep saying style over substance, guys. Listen to substance over style. So if your parents, an example of more closer to home, if your parents went through a divorce when you were a child and you're now more likely to believe that marriage is likely to fail, but that's not the case. So we try to tie these dramatic events to the absolute truth. And this could kind of go also for education purposes. So if you're in a class and a teacher makes you slides that jump out, they flash, they're colorful, you might listen to that information more, but maybe it's not as good as the information from a teacher teaching the exact same class. Maybe their slides are boring, but it has all the really crucial and critical information. So that's what I mean when I talk about substance over style. So how do we become better critical listeners? Be skeptic. And skepticism isn't just wrapped up in a negative connotation. It just means you're evaluating the evidence that someone's claim that they're trying to make. So if we talk about confirmation bias, and that people only pay attention to the information that supports their theories or their beliefs. Being skeptical, it means that you're putting your biases aside and you're looking at it in a more well-rounded perspective. You're looking at every piece of, or every corner of that debate and making that decision on your own. And so think about also being a skeptic, evaluating your speaker's credibility. You may be swayed by somebody because of your relationship with them. But what is their credibility? And so when we think of a speaker's credibility, I would assume you're more likely to believe what your doctor, who's been seeing you for years, tells you about what is wrong with you, what your symptoms are as a result, what is the diagnosis, than maybe your mom, unless your mom's a doctor. But let's say in this example, your mom's not a doctor, right? Because you're looking at the expert in the situation of a medical field. The expert in a medical field is going to be a doctor. On the flip side, we have experience and we have expertise, right? So a mom is an experienced parent. She's raised children. She's raised me, right? Talk about my mom. But she's not an expert because she's only lived her own experience. And so while I'm more likely, when I have kids, to call my mom and be like, Mom, there's a rash. And she might have experience about rashes. She might tell me what her experience was. But at the end, she might also say, but I'm no expert. You should probably see a doctor. And that's because we're talking about credibility of what is happening, what is going on. And that is how we evaluate a speaker's credibility. And then, of course, we have to understand probability. In our textbook on page 246, there is a figure, and it's just a temperature gauge, and it talks about possible, probable, and certainty, or certain. And that's the gauge of probability. Possible is any chance that a statement somebody is telling you is true. Probable is at least 50% chance that whatever statement somebody's telling you is true. And certain, or certainty, is 100%. What they are telling you is absolute fact. It is absolutely true. And so we have to be better critical listeners by being skeptical, by evaluating who is speaking and what their credibility is, and by understanding the probability of what they're saying to be true. So to wrap up this chapter, let's talk about how to be better how to be better empathic listeners. So we want to listen without interrupting. We want to listen without offering advice. How easy is it while you're listening to somebody to think that you have to be the problem solver? You have to give them some sort of advice. But sometimes that's not what's needed. Sometimes it's just a listening ear. And this is something that happens a lot in my life. I do vent a lot, but I also listen to a lot of people vent. People come to my office and talk to me all the time. And so when we talk about listening without interrupting, in my personal experience, sometimes me and my best friend, I'll be like, hey, I need to vent for a second. And her response will be, sure, do you need advice or do you just need me to listen? And that, again, asking clarifying questions helps prevent any sort of breakdown in communication and breakdown in a relationship. So if I say, hey, I just need you to listen, then great. Usually a response will be like, oh my gosh, I totally understand. I feel you. And just like supportive messages. But offering advice would be, if I ask for advice, I'm between a rock and a hard place. Oh, well, have you tried this? Or is this the hill you want to die on? And sometimes you just need the truthfulness. And so listening non-judgmentally, acknowledging their feelings, using continuous statements. So continuous statements are things that acknowledge that you're listening, but allows them to keep talking about their emotions. And we kind of talked about this when we talked about competitive interrupting and how I mentioned that not all interrupting is competitive. I might be listening to my friend and she might be having an emotional moment and needs my acknowledgement. And I might say, I understand how you, or I understand this must be super hard. this can't be an easy moment, or, like something that's supportive, but also is letting them know, like, keep speaking, I'm here, I'm listening. You want to use continuous statements and avoid terminator statements. And no, it's not Arnold Schwarzenegger statements. Terminator statements are acknowledging emotions right away, but then turning down the conversation. The ones that are really flat, like, oh, well, there's nothing you can do, or, oh, well, there's always tomorrow. You're not really giving them a chance to divulge deeper into how they're feeling. And in our textbook, they use an example of the doctor who, if you told them all what your concerns about your illness, and they said, that must make you feel very uncertain, or I can imagine how scary that is, that would make you feel better and feel like you were confident enough to keep talking about what was going on. But if they said, well, we're doing everything we can, you just need to give it some time, that would kind of make you feel unimportant, right? But among all things, we also have to communicate support non-verbally. So if my friend is feeling emotional, maybe she's crying, maybe I put a hand on her back and I rub her back and I say, it's going to be okay. We'll work through this together. But I'm nodding my head and maybe furrowing my brows to show that, like, I'm feeling her pain. I'm being an empathic listener, and I'm feeling the way that her emotions are coming to me. So we have to make sure that we're also communicating support non-verbally, if we don't want to interrupt. And so using all our entire bodies to communicate is always so important. And that's all that we have this week for listening. Part of this week's discussion is finding out what kind of listener you are. So I look forward to reading those. And if you have any questions about this chapter, you just shoot me an email.